Hi, in this session we're going to get ourselves started with Hibernate, and we're going to do it with a Hello World application. In that application we're going to create an object of this message class and use Hibernate to persist it to this Hello World database. We're going to use this ID attribute to uniquely identify a message object, and the text attribute is going to hold a Hello World message. Now we're going to need a JDBC connection if we want to persist the state of this message object to this Hello World database. And Hibernate provides us a session object that represents a conversation between an application and a database. It wraps a JDBC connection object. So we're going to use a session object to persist the state of this message object into this message table. And this session object comes from a session factory object, which is built by a configuration object. What this configuration object does is that it looks for a Hibernate configuration file in the root of the class path of an application and uses it to build a session factory object. So let's go ahead and have a look at this configuration file. So we have provided the connection URL, JDBC driver class, username and password for Hibernate to connect to the Hello World database in MySQL. Now, every database behaves differently, so this dialect setting allows Hibernate to generate SQL optimized for MySQL. Then we tell Hibernate to write all the SQL code to the console whenever it's interacting with the Hello World database. And then finally, we tell it about the mapping file it's going to use to map the message class to the message table. There are many other settings we could configure in this configuration file that could control the behavior of Hibernate in runtime. And with all this information inside these session factory tags, building a session factory is a resource-intensive process. And that's why only a single instance of session factory is created for an application. So unless your application is using more than one data source, you're going to create only one session factory for the entire application. So let's go ahead and build a session factory object. And we're going to do it in a helper class called Hibernate util. All you have to understand about this class is that it's creating a single instance of the session factory object that's going to be shared throughout the application, and it's going to be created by this configuration object using the Hibernate configuration file, which needs to be in the root of the class path of the application. So you just have to call this getSessionFactory method to get a reference of the session factory object. And yes, you need to have these jar files from the Hibernate distribution package in the class path of your application for Hibernate to be able to do its work. Now, let's go ahead and have a look at this mapping file, which Hibernate is going to need to map this message class to this message table. So first, between the two Hibernate mapping tags, we have a class element that's mapping the message class to the message table. And we have a package attribute where we declare the package in which we have the classes that we want to be mapped to database tables. And we have the message class here in the domain package. Next, we're going to use this ID element to map the identifier attribute of the message class to the primary key column of the message table. And now that we mapped the identifier attribute, we have to decide how its values are generated. And that's where this nested generator element comes into play. We are using the native strategy here, which delegates the work of primary key generation to the underlying database. And we are using the auto increment attribute in the primary key column of the message table. So a unique primary key value is generated by MySQL for this ID column whenever a new row is inserted to this message table. And then Hibernate is going to set this primary key value in the ID attribute of the persisted message object. So if you were wondering that where this value 1 came from when we talked about persisting this message object into this message table, the answer to that was that it was generated by MySQL when the state of this message object was inserted into this message table. Next, we're going to map the text attribute in the message class to the text column in the message table using this property element. And the string here is neither the Java data type nor the SQL data type. It's a Hibernate mapping type that's going to take care of the translation from the Java data types to the SQL data types and vice versa. So it's going to take care of the translation between the string data type to the var char data type. And if you did not notice, we did not specify any Hibernate mapping type for the ID element here to map the ID attribute to the ID column. And that's because in most cases, Hibernate is smart enough to figure out the correct mapping type itself if the type attribute is not present in the mapping. So behind the scene, it's using long Hibernate mapping type to take care of the translation from long Java data type to big int SQL data type and vice versa. So we've done the mapping between the message class and the message table using this Hibernate mapping file. And the information in this mapping file is called object relational mapping metadata. And as this message class is mapped to this message table and its objects are now able to be persisted to that table, we call this message class a persistent class. It's just a plain old Java object with a no argument constructor and a getter and setter methods for its data attributes. And yes, we're going to need this mapping file and this message class in the same package. So if you have the message class in the domain package, we're going to need this mapping file in the domain package as well. Now that we've got everything in place, let's go ahead and do some Java persistence. So first we are getting hold of a session object, and then we tell it that it's about to be used for some database interactions by calling its begin transaction method. Then on line number 14, we create a message object that we want to be persisted to the Hello World database. And once the line 14 is executed, this is going to be the state of the message object. Its ID value will be null. And then comes the point of execution for which we've been doing all the work so far. We call this save method that's going to execute this insert statement to the Hello World database. So once the line 16 has been executed, this is going to be the state of the message object. The value of ID here has been changed to 1. But at this point, if you have a look at this message table, we have no data inside it yet. So why is that? We just executed this insert statement to the database, and we even got the ID value of the message object changed from null to 1. But we don't have any data inside the message table. Then where does value 1 came from? The answer to that is that behind the scene, Hibernate is using JDBC transactions here. So Hibernate has executed this insert statement to the Hello World database, and a new row has even been inserted to the message table on which MySQL generated a new primary key value for the ID column, and Hibernate then set the ID value of the message object using that newly generated primary key value. But you're still not able to find the inserted row in this message table because the database interaction that we started on line number 12 has not been completed yet, and it's going to complete only when the line 18 has been executed. So once the line 18 has been executed and the transaction is committed, we'll be able to see this inserted row in the message table. I hope it was not too confusing. You just have to know that this message object will be persisted to the Hello World database only when the database interaction that we started on line number 12 is completed, which is happening only once the line 18 is executed. And then we are closing the conversation with the Hello World database by calling this close method. Great, we just had a taste of Hibernate. You might be thinking that it was too much work for persisting a simple message object, and you're right. If the application that you're working on has only few tables to work with, then you might as well use JDBC directly. Otherwise, you'll need to configure Hibernate just once, and after that you'll be calling simple Java methods for Java persistence. Now, I know that you might be complaining about this XML-based metadata that you'll have to manage in a separate file, which is why we're going to use a much simple approach of annotation-based metadata using JPA annotations to specify the mapping between the message class and the message table. Now, this JPA annotated message class is holding exactly the same mapping information as this mapping file. The entity annotation tells Hibernate that this message class is a persistent entity that needs to have its state persisted to the Hello World database. The table annotation specifies the name of the table that you want this message entity to map to, and we are mapping it to the message table. Then you declare the ID annotation to indicate that this ID attribute represents the primary key or unique identifier of the message table. Then this generated value annotation with auto strategy tells Hibernate that whenever a new message entity is persisted to the Hello World database, the database will generate a unique primary key value for that entity. And then Hibernate is going to set the value of this ID attribute using that newly generated primary key value. This is same as what this native strategy in the mapping file was doing for us. And then this column annotation tells Hibernate about the column you want to map this ID attribute to. And then again, we are using this column annotation to map this text attribute to the text column in the message table. And then one final change we need to make before we rubbish this Hibernate mapping file is to change the mapping resource attribute to mapping class attribute and specify the class we declared as an entity. And now that we've done the mapping using JPA annotations, we don't need this Hibernate mapping file anymore. And throughout this course, we'll be using only JPA annotations to specify mappings between Java classes and database tables.